The cold mud of the town square seeped through the thin leather of the boots belonging to Evelina. She stood on the rough pine boards of the auction block, her delicate frame shivering violently against the biting autumn wind. The booming voice of the magistrate echoed off the wooden storefronts, declaring the debts of her late husband absolute and unpayable. The crowd below sneered, their faces twisted with cruel amusement and harsh judgment. They called her worthless. They shouted terrible things about a fragile widow who had nothing left to give the world. The wooden gavel struck the podium with a deafening crack. Evelina closed her hazel eyes, preparing for the final humiliation of forced labor. But the truth behind this cruel spectacle was far more complicated than anyone in that miserable valley ever imagined. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The magistrate spat into the dirt and raised his hands, demanding a final bid from the gathering. He declared that the fragile woman standing before them would be sold to the highest bidder to scrub the heavy stone floors of the local tavern until the debt was paid in full. The crowd erupted into loud, mocking laughter. Evelina kept her chin lowered. She wrapped her pale fingers into the frayed fabric of her sleeve, twisting the rough dark cotton to keep her hands from trembling. It was a quiet habit, a small physical defense against a world that had stripped away everything she ever loved. The damp wool of her modest day dress offered no protection against the chilling wind, yet the coldness of the townspeople felt infinitely worse. Then, the laughter died. It did not fade slowly. It stopped at once, as if the breath had been stolen from the lungs of every single man present. The crowd parted in absolute silence. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crushed the frozen mud. Evelina opened her eyes and saw a massive shadow eclipse the pale afternoon sun. A giant of a man stepped toward the wooden platform. He was a towering mountain of solid muscle and heavy canvas, wrapped in a thick coat lined with dark fur. Broad shoulders entirely blocked the wind from reaching the wooden platform. His face was weathered, deeply tanned by extreme altitude and harsh sun, framed by a thick dark beard. A small, faded scar rested above his left eyebrow, speaking to a life of quiet survival. He carried the wild, untamed presence of the high peaks, a physical presence that made the rough men of the valley shrink back in genuine fear. This was Callahan. The people of the valley whispered terrified stories about the solitary trapper, painting him as a savage beast who lived far above the snowline. Callahan did not look at the magistrate. He did not look at the frightened townspeople. He looked only at the rough pine boards beneath the scuffed boots of Evelina. The magistrate swallowed hard. The booming voice suddenly reduced to a nervous, high-pitched stammer. He asked the towering stranger if he had business in the square. Callahan reached a massive, calloused hand inside the heavy folds of his winter coat. The movement was slow and deliberate, carrying an air of absolute authority. He pulled forth a thick, heavy leather pouch. The leather was worn and dark with age, tied with a heavy cord. He tossed the pouch onto the wooden podium. The impact sounded like a heavy stone striking the earth. The leather strings came loose, spilling a pile of solid gold coins and thick wads of folded paper currency across the ledger of the magistrate. It was a staggering sum. It was the absolute entirety of the life savings belonging to the giant man. A collective gasp rippled through the freezing square. The magistrate stared at the gold, his eyes wide with immense greed and utter confusion. He stuttered, confirming that the amount far exceeded the meager debt of the widow. Callahan spoke for the first time. His voice was a deep, low rumble, like distant thunder rolling across a darkened valley. He instructed the magistrate to mark the debt paid in full. He demanded that the ledger reflect the total freedom of the widow. The sheer authority in his voice left no room for debate. The magistrate nodded furiously, sweeping the gold into his satchel before slamming the gavel down one final time. Evelina stood frozen on the block. The bitter wind continued to howl, but the words of the giant echoed louder in her mind. He had bought her debt. He had purchased her freedom, but she had no idea what he demanded in return. The men of the valley only bought things they intended to use. She braced herself, fully expecting the giant to grab her by the arm and drag her away like a prize won at a country fair. Instead, Callahan took a single step back. He removed his heavy felt hat, exposing his dark hair to the freezing rain. He lowered his head in a gesture of profound, unexpected respect. It was a subtle movement, thought, but to a woman who had been treated like dirt for agonizing months, it felt like a sudden warm fire lit in a dark, freezing room. For a brief second, an older woman in the front row met the eyes of Evelina and offered a soft, sympathetic nod. A tiny moment of human warmth in a vast sea of cruelty. Callahan raised his head and looked at Evelina. His deep brown eyes did not hold malice. They did not hold lust or harsh ownership. They held a quiet, overwhelming sorrow, as if looking at her fragile state caused him physical pain. He extended a massive hand toward the edge of the platform. He did not reach for her. He simply offered his hand as a bridge, waiting patiently for her to make the choice to step down. The wood of the platform was slick with rain. Evelina hesitated. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She looked at the terrifying stranger, then at the cruel faces of the townspeople who had completely abandoned her. She released the frayed hem of her sleeve, taking a deep, trembling breath. She reached out and placed her small, pale hand over the rough palm of the giant. The contrast was startling. Her hand looked like a fragile white dove resting upon a weathered piece of mountain stone. Callahan closed his fingers very gently, taking incredible care not to squeeze her delicate bones. The warmth radiating from his skin was shocking against the freezing dampness of her own fingers. He guided her down the rough wooden steps with slow, steady movements. He led her toward a heavy wooden wagon hitched to two massive draft horses. The wagon was loaded with winter supplies, thick sacks of flour, and tightly rolled wool blankets. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as the silent beast of the mountain helped the broken widow climb onto the wooden bench of the wagon. Callahan walked around the mighty horses, checking the leather harnesses with quiet efficiency. He climbed onto the bench beside her, his massive frame taking up most of the space. Yet he kept a very careful distance, ensuring his heavy coat did not press against her shivering shoulder. He took the leather reins in his bare hands. With a soft click of his tongue, he urged the heavy horses forward. The wooden wheels groaned against the frozen mud, leaving the miserable town square far behind. They turned toward the dark, looming silhouette of the distant mountains. Evelina sat rigid on the hard wooden seat. The freezing wind whipped at her pale cheeks. She stole a fearful glance at the silent giant beside her. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on the winding road ahead. He had surrendered his entire life savings for a woman he did not know. He had emptied his pockets to save her from a life of cruel labor. Yet he demanded absolutely nothing from her in return. The path ahead grew steeper, winding into the dark. Towering pines where the snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes. The air grew desperately cold, and the deep isolation of the wild frontier closed in around them. Evelina hugged her thin arms across her chest, her mind racing with a terrifying, unanswerable question. Why did this terrifying stranger surrender his entire life savings for a woman he does not know? And exactly where into the brutal, frozen wilderness was he taking her? The iron rims of the wagon wheels ground heavily against the frozen earth, carving deep tracks into the rising mountain path. The miserable town lay far below, swallowed by the thickening gray mist of the afternoon. The air grew significantly colder with every passing mile. The harsh wind of the winter whipped through the barren branches of the lower valley, carrying the sharp bite of impending snow. Evelina sat rigid on the hard wooden bench. Her slender frame trembled violently beneath the thin, faded fabric of her cotton dress. She wrapped her pale fingers tightly into the frayed edge of her sleeve, twisting the rough material over and over. The small, nervous habit was the only anchor she had in a world that had suddenly turned completely unrecognizable. She stole a cautious glance at the giant man sitting beside her. He drove the massive draft horses with quiet, effortless command. The leather reins rested lightly in his bare, calloused hands. He did not yell at the beasts. He did not crack a whip. He simply offered a low, deep hum, and the magnificent animals leaned into the heavy leather harnesses, pulling the heavy wagon up the treacherous incline. The snow began to fall, descending in thick, heavy flakes that caught in the dark hair and thick beard belonging to the mountain man. He seemed entirely immune to the freezing temperature, an immovable force of nature completely at peace in the brutal wilderness. The cold began to deeply affect the fragile body belonging to Evelina. Her lips turned a pale shade of blue, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. She squeezed her eyes shut, expecting the silent stranger to grow annoyed with her weakness. The men in the valley had always despised weakness. They viewed tears as an inconvenience and physical frailty as a deep moral failure. She braced herself for a harsh reprimand, a cruel reminder that she was merely purchased property expected to endure the misery without complaint. The heavy wagon suddenly groaned to a halt. Evelina gasped, her hazel eyes flying open in sudden panic. They were completely isolated on the winding mountain trail. Endless walls of ancient, snow-draped pine trees surrounded them on all sides. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the heavy breathing of the draft horses. Callahan stood up. The sheer size of his towering frame blocked out the fading light of the sun. He turned toward her. Evelina pressed her back against the wooden seat, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected a rough hand to grab her arm. She expected the terrifying reality of her situation to finally reveal itself. Instead, the giant man unfastened the heavy brass buttons of his thick, fur-lined mountain coat. He slipped the massive garment from his broad shoulders. The biting wind immediately struck his worn flannel shirt, yet he did not even flinch. With agonizing slowness, taking extreme care not to startle her, he leaned forward. He draped the enormous, heavy coat over the trembling shoulders belonging to Evelina. The sheer weight of the leather pressed down upon her, instantly shielding her from the brutal wind. The thick fur lining carried the profound, radiating heat from the body of the mountain man. It enveloped her in a sudden, overwhelming cocoon of absolute warmth. A deeply comforting scent rose from the collar of the coat. It smelled of ancient pine needles, rich wood smoke, and clean winter air. It was the scent of safety. It was the most profound physical comfort she had experienced since the terrible death of her late husband. Callahan reached into the wooden bed of the wagon. He retrieved a heavy, smooth river stone wrapped in a thick wool rag. The stone had been heated in the fire of the town blacksmith before their departure. He knelt on the floorboard of the wagon, bending his massive frame into the cramped space. Without speaking a single word, He placed the heated stone directly against the thin, scuffed leather of the boots belonging to Evelina. The heat seeped through the frozen soles, sending a wave of glorious relief up her numb legs. He stood back up and pulled a heavy wool blanket from a canvas sack, tucking the edges firmly around her knees to block the creeping draft. Throughout the entire process, Callahan never once looked directly into her eyes. He kept his gaze lowered, focusing entirely on the task of securing her warmth. He moved with a quiet, sacred reverence, treating her fragile form not as purchased property, but as something incredibly precious and deeply worthy of protection. The realization struck the heart of Evelina with staggering force. The terrifying beast of the mountain was going to freeze in his thin flannel shirt just to ensure a stranger did not suffer in the cold. He returned to the wooden bench, leaving a wide, respectful distance between them. He took up the leather reins. With a soft, gentle click of his tongue, the mighty horses resumed their slow, steady march up the mountain path. The heavy snow continued to fall, blanketing the forest in pristine white. The deep terror that had consumed the mind of Evelina began to slowly dissolve, melting away beneath the overwhelming warmth of the heavy coat. A profound, cautious bewilderment took the place of her fear. She watched the stoic profile of the giant from the corner of her eye. The snow gathered on his broad shoulders and damp flannel shirt, yet he sat completely perfectly still, his powerful jaw set in quiet determination. For the first time in an agonizing eternity, she did not feel like a burden. She felt entirely shielded. The cruel judgment of the town square felt like a distant nightmare, completely severed by the silent protection of the towering woodsman. The hours stretched on, the wagon climbing higher into the untamed wilderness. The air grew thin and incredibly crisp. The shadows of the ancient trees stretched long across the undisturbed snow. Evelina buried her face deeper into the fur collar of the coat, letting the scent of woodsmoke and pine calm her racing mind. The steady, rhythmic swaying of the wagon and the profound warmth surrounding her body brought a heavy, unavoidable exhaustion to her eyes. The twilight finally gave way to the deep, impenetrable blackness of the mountain night. The horses turned off the main trail, navigating a narrow, hidden path completely obscured by the heavy snowfall. The towering pines suddenly parted, revealing a vast, flat clearing at the very summit of the peak. The wagon rolled to a gentle stop before the dark silhouette of a massive, rugged timber cabin. The structure looked as solid and unyielding as the mountain itself, built from enormous peeled logs and heavy river stones. There was no light in the windows. There was no smoke rising from the heavy stone chimney. It looked incredibly lonely, a silent fortress standing against the edge of the world. Callahan secured the leather reins. He finally turned his head toward the passenger seat, his face cast in deep shadow by the pale light of the rising moon. He still kept his eyes carefully averted, staring only at the rough wood of the dashboard. The sheer intensity of his deliberate avoidance sent a new shiver through the spine of Evelina, one entirely unrelated to the winter cold. What awaited them inside that dark, isolated summit? And exactly why did the silent giant completely refuse to look her in the eye? The heavy iron rims of the wagon wheels ground to a final, echoing halt in the deep, undisturbed snow. The silence of the mountain summit pressed heavily against the frozen timber of the cabin. It was an absolute, ancient silence, vastly different from the loud and cruel noise of the valley below. The heavy draft horses breathed thick clouds of white steam into the freezing night air, their massive heads lowered in deep exhaustion. Callahan climbed down from the wooden bench, his heavy boots crushing the pristine layer of untouched snow with a loud, rhythmic crunch. The bitter wind howled through the high branches of the ancient pines, a lonely and desperate sound that made the fragile frame belonging to Evelina shiver violently beneath the heavy fur coat. Callahan walked to the side of the wooden wagon. He reached up, ducked, offering his large, calloused hands toward the trembling widow. Evelina hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She placed her pale, freezing fingers upon his broad palms. The sheer physical strength of the mountain man was deeply terrifying. Yet he lifted her from the high seat and lowered her to the ground with the absolute care of a man holding a fragile glass ornament. His touch held no demand. It offered only immediate physical safety. He gestured toward the heavy timber door of the dark cabin. He led the way through the rising snowdrifts, pushing the heavy wood open to reveal a wall of profound, freezing darkness. The air inside the cabin was completely stagnant and as cold as a frozen tomb. It carried the faint, dry scent of old wood smoke, cured leather, and bundled sage hanging from the rafters. Evelina stepped over the wooden threshold, her scuffed leather boots moving very quietly across the rough floorboards. Callahan struck a long wooden match against the stone frame of the fireplace. The sudden flare of bright yellow light illuminated the harsh angles of his weathered face. He touched the small flame to the thick wick of an oil lantern hanging from a heavy iron hook. A soft, golden glow slowly washed over the room, pushing back the deep shadows of the corners. The cabin belonging to the giant was entirely Spartan. The walls consisted of massive peeled logs, perfectly joined and sealed with hard clay to keep the brutal winter wind entirely at bay. A heavy wooden table stood in the center of the room, flanked by two simple chairs carved from rough pine. A cast iron stove sat perfectly clean in the corner of a small kitchen area. It was clearly the dwelling of a man who lived completely alone, a man who required absolutely no comfort and expected no visitors. Callahan knelt before the large stone hearth. He arranged dry pine bark and thick split oak logs with quiet, practiced efficiency. He reached into a small iron tin, retrieving a piece of charred cloth, and struck a piece of flint. A bright spark caught immediately. Within moments, a roaring fire leaped into the dark chimney. The vivid crackle of the dry wood echoed loudly in the silent room. A glorious, heavy wave of intense, radiant heat washed across the freezing limbs belonging to Evelina. She stepped closer to the stone hearth, holding her pale, trembling hands out toward the bright orange flames. The deep, agonizing cold that had settled into her bones slowly began to thaw. Callahan stood up and walked toward the far side of the single room. A large, heavy wooden bed frame rested against the log wall. It was piled high with thick, woven wool blankets and heavy, cured bearskins. It was the only bed in the entire dwelling. He pulled the heavy furs back, smoothing the clean cotton sheets underneath. He stepped away, leaving a wide distance between himself and the furniture. He turned toward Evelina and gestured softly toward the soft mattress. He wanted her to take his bed. Evelina felt a sudden, sharp twist of deep anxiety tighten in her chest. She remembered the cruel, mocking words of the town magistrate. She remembered the terrible humiliation of the auction block. She had spent the last agonizing months being told she was a worthless burden, a fragile problem to be solved by endless toil. She had been purchased to perform harsh labor, and her battered mind believed her only right to draw breath depended on breaking her back in service. She wrapped her pale fingers tightly around the frayed fabric of her sleeve, twisting the dark cotton over and over. She stepped away from the warm hearth. She kept her voice very low, a fragile whisper trembling with deeply ingrained fear. She stated firmly that she was brought there to work. She explained that she fully intended to earn her keep and prove her worth. She offered to sleep on the hard floor near the fire, claiming she was completely ready to cook, mend clothing, and scrub the rough timber boards to repay the massive fortune he had spent to acquire her freedom. Callahan stopped moving. The towering mountain man turned slowly. He looked at the fragile, terrified widow standing in the center of his lonely cabin. His deep brown eyes softened with a profound, overwhelming sadness. He recognized the deep emotional wounds carved into her soul by the cruel men of the valley. He shook his head. The movement was slow, silent, and entirely absolute. He pointed a massive finger toward the soft bed, his silent command gentle but completely unyielding. He refused to let her debase herself. He refused to validate the cruel lie that her existence required payment in sweat and pain. Callahan walked to a heavy wooden chest, resting against the opposite wall. He opened the heavy lid and retrieved 3 worn, thin blankets. He carried the modest pile to the front of the room, directly in front of the heavy timber door. He spread the thin blankets across the freezing, unyielding floorboards. He was placing his massive body as a physical shield between her and the dangerous world outside. He sat down heavily upon the rough wood, leaning his broad shoulders against the timber wall. He stretched his long legs out, crossing his heavy boots. He closed his eyes, signaling that the conversation was entirely finished. He surrendered his only source of true comfort so that she might finally rest in absolute peace. Evelina stood frozen in the center of the warm room. A profound emotional revelation washed over her tired mind. The cruel townspeople had treated her as worthless property, but this terrifying stranger treated her with the absolute dignity of a queen. The deep, heavy walls of ice protecting her battered heart cracked for the very first time. The quiet dawn of mutual respect settled warmly into her weary spirit. She realized with a sudden, overwhelming clarity that she was truly safe. The giant would never harm her. She walked slowly toward the heavy wooden bed. She slipped the thick, heavy mountain coat from her narrow shoulders, folding it with immense care and placing it upon the wooden chair. She climbed beneath the heavy furs. The scent of ancient pine and clean snow wrapped around her exhausted body. The glorious warmth of the heavy blankets felt like a sacred embrace she had not experienced in many agonizing years. She turned her head upon the soft pillow, watching the dying light of the fire dance across the rough log walls. The golden shadows flickered and stretched into the dark corners of the large cabin. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed a strange detail in the far back corner of the room, completely hidden behind the dark shadow of the cast-iron stove. It was a heavy door. Unlike the simple timber construction of the front entrance, this door was built from thick, solid oak. Heavy, dark iron bands reinforced the wood. A massive, rusted iron padlock secured a thick metal latch, locking the door tight against the wall. It looked completely out of place, resembling the impenetrable door of a bank vault, hidden inside a simple trapper dwelling. Evelina listened to the steady, deep breathing of the giant sleeping on the hard floorboards near the front entrance. Her eyelids grew incredibly heavy, but her mind raced with a sudden, burning curiosity. What immense secret required such absolute protection? And what exactly was hidden behind the heavy locked door in the back of the cabin? The pale gray light of the mountain morning crept through the single frost-covered window of the heavy timber cabin. The furious winter storm outside had finally ceased. A profound, heavy stillness blanketed the rugged summit. Evelina opened her heavy eyelids, but the rough timber ceiling spun violently above her. A terrible, crushing weight pressed down upon her delicate chest. the brutal exposure on the public auction block, the freezing wind of the miserable valley, and the endless, agonizing months of near starvation had finally demanded their physical toll. A severe, burning fever raged furiously through the fragile veins belonging to the widow. She attempted to push the heavy bearskins aside, desperate to escape the sudden, suffocating heat. Her frail muscles entirely refused to obey. A sharp, ragged cough tore through her raw throat, echoing loudly in the absolute silence of the room. The heavy leather boots belonging to Callahan instantly hit the rough floorboards. The giant man had spent the entire night sitting against the front door, remaining fully awake to guard her rest. He crossed the large room in 3 massive strides. He stood beside the heavy wooden bed, his broad silhouette blocking the pale morning light. He looked down. The pale porcelain skin of the delicate woman was now flushed with a dangerous, bright red heat. Deep beads of cold sweat gathered upon her brow. She trembled violently beneath the furs, wrapping her pale fingers into the thick edge of the woven blanket, twisting the fabric over and over in a desperate, subconscious search for comfort. Callahan did not hesitate. The stoic, respectful distance he had maintained the previous night completely vanished, replaced by an urgent, deeply focused care. He turned immediately toward the small cast-iron stove. He stoked the glowing red embers and added thin strips of dry cedar wood. He pulled a heavy iron kettle from a wooden shelf and filled the metal container with clean, packed snow from a wooden bucket resting near the entrance. He placed the heavy metal directly over the growing yellow flames. Next, he retrieved a series of small, tightly tied bundles of dried herbs hanging from the heavy timber rafters above the kitchen area. His massive hands, heavily scarred from breaking solid wood and surviving the brutal frontier, moved with an astonishing, intricate delicacy. He crushed dry silver willow bark, wild sweet mint, and dried white yarrow flowers into a small wooden bowl. The profound homemaking skills belonging to the solitary trapper were deeply evident in every single, efficient movement. He lived entirely alone upon the roof of the world, surviving only through immense practical knowledge of the wild, untamed mountain. He poured the boiling water over the crushed medicinal herbs. A thick, earthy steam filled the freezing cabin, carrying a sharp, cleansing fragrance that cut through the stagnant air. Callahan walked back to the heavy wooden bed. He carried a small ceramic mug in one hand and a clean, folded linen cloth in the other. He dipped the white cloth into a separate wooden basin of freezing cold water, wringing out the excess moisture with great care. He knelt slowly beside the mattress. The heavy timber frame creaked slightly beneath his massive, immovable weight. He reached out. His thick, calloused fingers brushed gently against the burning skin belonging to Evelina. The physical contrast was deeply striking. His hand was entirely rough, heavily textured like weathered canyon stone. Yet his deliberate touch was significantly lighter than a falling snow feather. He placed the freezing, damp cloth across her burning forehead. A soft, breathless sigh escaped her cracked, dry lips. The glorious, cooling relief instantly soothed the terrible fire burning deeply behind her hazel eyes. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a very low, rumbling hum of pure, unquestioning reassurance. He offered a gentle gesture, encouraging her to drink the warm medicine. He slipped his massive, muscular arm carefully beneath her delicate shoulders. He lifted her fragile frame with absolute ease, supporting her upper body completely so she did not have to expend any of her own fading physical strength. He held the rim of the ceramic mug to her pale lips, The herbal tea was incredibly bitter, but it carried a deep, soothing warmth that immediately coated her raw, painful throat. Evelina swallowed very slowly. She let her heavy head rest completely against the solid, immovable wall of his broad chest. The steady, deep rhythm of his beating heart sounded like a slow, rhythmic, protective drum. For the very first time in her entire adult life, Evelina felt entirely physically safe in a state of absolute vulnerability. The cruel men of the valley below had always viewed physical sickness as an intolerable, highly offensive burden. The late husband belonging to Evelina used to lock himself inside his private study whenever she fell ill, completely disgusted by human frailty and loudly demanding she cure herself in absolute silence. Yet, this terrifying beast of the isolated mountain held her with infinite, quiet patience. He gently wiped the stray, feverish tears from her flushed cheeks using the rough pad of his massive thumb. He did not judge her sudden weakness. He offered only pure, sacred sanctuary. The profound emotional reflection settled deep into her feverish, swirling mind. The heavy, protective walls of ice she had built around her battered soul began to crack, crumble, and fall entirely away. She realized the stoic giant possessed a spirit constructed entirely of warm, sheltering wood, completely opposite to the cold, unforgiving stone of the civilized world waiting below the snow line. The exhausting medicine pulled her back down into a deep, heavy, restorative slumber. The bright winter sun climbed significantly higher into the vast white sky. Yet the harsh mountain cold remained completely trapped outside the thick timber walls. Throughout the long, quiet hours of the fading day, Callahan absolutely refused to leave her side. He sat perfectly still upon the hard wooden chair beside the heavy bed. He constantly replaced the cooling linen cloth. He carefully fed her very small sips of warm, rich broth made from cured meat and dried wild roots. He watched the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, his dark eyes filled with a quiet, desperate, unspoken hope for her immediate recovery. As the dark purple shadows of the evening began to stretch slowly across the rough floorboards, the internal fever spiked higher one final time. The mind belonging to Evelina drifted into a deep, chaotic delirium. The terrible, haunting memories of the cruel valley returned, twisting violently into dark, frightening shapes behind her closed eyelids. She tossed her head restlessly against the soft cotton pillow. Her breathing grew very rapid and highly shallow. She reached her pale, trembling hand out into the empty air, her thin fingers grasping blindly for something she desperately needed but could not find. Callahan leaned forward immediately. He took her fragile, trembling hand into both of his massive, warm palms. He held her tiny fingers incredibly gently, offering the solid, undeniable reality of his physical presence to pull her back from the edge of the dark nightmare. The immense heat of her delicate skin burned heavily against his rough calluses. Evelina squeezed the heavy fingers of the giant. A desperate, with fractured sob tore from her delicate chest. Her hazel eyes remained tightly closed, entirely trapped in the heavy grip of the raging fever. She turned her beautiful face toward the dark shadows of the cabin roof. A fragile, devastating whisper escaped her trembling lips, carrying a profound sorrow that completely shattered the quiet silence of the lonely room. She begged for forgiveness. She promised repeatedly that she would definitely return. She pleaded for them to wait just a little bit longer. Then, she muttered a single, highly secret name directly into the empty night air. Callahan froze completely. He stared down at the delicate, tear-stained face of the suffering widow. The heavy rusted iron padlock on the back door remained entirely secure. But a new, profound mystery had just unlocked inside his lonely dwelling. Exactly who was Clara? And what terrible, hidden promise had Evelina made that forced her onto the cruel public auction block in the very first place? The heavy fever finally broke on the morning of the third day. The deep, restorative sleep relinquished its tight grip on the mind belonging to Evelina. She opened her hazel eyes. The harsh, frightening delirium had completely vanished. The air inside the cabin of the mountain man was crisp and completely still. Yet a deep, ambient warmth radiated from the glowing stones of the heavy hearth. She sat up slowly. The terrible weakness in her delicate limbs had significantly lessened. Callahan was not inside the dwelling. The heavy timber door was securely latched from the inside, meaning he had slipped out very early and locked it behind him to ensure her absolute safety. Evelina pushed the heavy bearskins aside. She stood upon the rough floorboards, her bare feet registering the smooth, worn texture of the ancient wood. A quiet, profound peace settled over her recovering spirit. For the very first time in countless agonizing months, nobody was screaming demands at her. Nobody was calculating her financial worth. She possessed the total freedom to simply exist. She walked slowly toward the small kitchen area. The massive hands belonging to Callahan were incredibly capable of surviving the brutal wilderness. But the domestic state of the cabin reflected a man who ate only for pure fuel. Heavy sacks of raw flour rested against the log wall. Strings of dried, salted meat hung from the high rafters. A wooden bin held robust winter root vegetables. She gathered her long, tangled chestnut hair, tying the heavy locks back with a small strip of torn cotton from her frayed hem. She washed her pale face in the wooden basin, embracing the freezing water to fully wake her tired senses. Then, she set to work. She utilized the deep homemaking skills she had learned long before the tragic death of her late husband. She measured the white flour into a heavy wooden bowl, adding clean water and a pinch of salt. Her pale fingers, previously trembling with terror on the auction block, now moved with beautiful, quiet purpose. She kneaded the heavy dough upon the scrubbed wooden table. She chopped the tough dried meat and winter roots, placing the ingredients into the heavy iron pot over the hot stove. She filled the cabin with a glorious, rich scent of baking bread and deeply savory stew. The sharp aroma of crushed wild thyme and slow-cooked onions completely overpowered the stagnant smell of old wood smoke. Evelina twisted the frayed edge of her dark sleeve, staring out the single frosted window. The sky above the mountain had turned a dark, angry gray. The heavy wind of a new blizzard began to howl fiercely through the high pines. The isolation of the summit felt entirely complete. The heavy iron latch of the front door rattled loudly. The massive oak swung open, admitting a furious blast of freezing white snow. Callahan stepped over the threshold. His towering frame was entirely covered in thick, white powder. He carried an enormous load of freshly chopped firewood, stacked high upon his broad shoulders. He turned to kick the heavy door shut, sealing the brutal storm outside. He dropped the heavy timber into the large stone bin beside the hearth. He turned around, brushing the freezing snow from his thick beard. Then, he completely froze. The giant man stood absolutely motionless in the center of the room. His deep brown eyes widened in profound, silent shock. The cold, lifeless wooden box he had inhabited for 10 long years was suddenly filled with an incredible, overwhelming warmth. The glorious scent of the hot meal hit his freezing senses with the force of a physical blow. He looked at the cast iron stove. He looked at the perfectly baked round loaf of bread, resting upon the heavy wooden table. Finally, he looked directly at Evelina. The fragile widow stood near the roaring fire. The pale, deathly complexion of her severe illness had completely vanished, replaced by a soft, healthy flush upon her cheeks. She did not shrink away from his massive, intimidating presence. She offered a very soft, highly hesitant smile. She gestured toward the wooden table. Her voice remained a gentle, fragile whisper. She invited him to sit. She informed him that the hot meal was entirely ready. Callahan swallowed hard. He removed his heavy, snow-covered coat, hanging the damp leather upon the iron hook. He washed his massive, calloused hands in the basin, moving with agonizing slowness, entirely afraid that this beautiful domestic illusion would shatter if he moved too quickly. He approached the wooden chair. He fully expected her to serve him and step back into the dark shadows, exactly as the miserable women of the valley were forced to do for their harsh husbands. Instead, Evelina filled 2 heavy ceramic bowls with the rich, steaming stew. She placed one directly in front of the giant man. Then, she walked to the opposite side of the small table and sat down in the second wooden chair. She claimed her rightful space as an equal human being. She tore the warm bread in half, placing the larger portion gently beside his bowl. The profound dignity of the simple action struck the lonely heart belonging to Callahan. He picked up his wooden spoon. He tasted the hot, savory broth. It was the most incredible thing he had consumed in a decade. The deep, rich flavors carried the undeniable, miraculous essence of human care. He closed his eyes. A powerful, physical shudder ran through his massive shoulders. He realized, with sudden and absolute clarity, exactly how crushing and terrible his isolation had truly been. He had survived the brutal mountain, but he had not truly lived. He opened his deep brown eyes, looking across the wooden table. The quiet admiration shining in his gaze was completely unmistakable. He offered a very low, rumbling hum of pure gratitude. Evelina lowered her gaze, but the soft smile on her lips deepened significantly. The invisible, heavy walls of defensive ice separating them melted entirely away, leaving behind a profound domestic harmony. The lonely cabin finally felt like a true home. They finished the warm meal in deep, comfortable silence. The raging blizzard outside intensified violently. The brutal wind screamed against the heavy log walls, shaking the thick timber frame of the isolated dwelling. The intense storm completely swallowed the fading afternoon light, plunging the mountain into an early, unnatural darkness. Evelina stood up to gather the empty ceramic bowls. She walked toward the cast iron stove. Suddenly, a massive, unnatural shadow passed directly over the single frosted window. The dark shape did not belong to a wild animal. It was far too tall, far too deliberate. Evelina stopped moving. The heavy ceramic bowl slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering violently against the hard floorboards. The sharp crash echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Callahan stood up instantly. His massive frame shifted directly into a stance of absolute, highly lethal defense. He stepped completely in front of Evelina, using his broad shoulders to shield her fragile body from the front entrance. 3 seconds later, a heavy, aggressive knock struck the thick oak of the front door. The violent sound pounded above the roaring noise of the blizzard. Someone had braved the deadly mountain storm to reach the isolated summit. The deep, terrifying dread instantly returned to the chest of the widow. The cruel world below had finally found them. Exactly who was standing on the freezing threshold? And what terrible demand were they bringing to the silent protector? The violent sound pounded against the thick oak again. It was a harsh, demanding rhythm that entirely shattered the peaceful warmth of the solitary cabin. Evelina stepped backward, her breath catching sharply in her fragile throat. She instinctively wrapped her pale, trembling fingers into the frayed fabric of her dark cotton sleeve, twisting the rough material over and over. The cruel, unforgiving world had somehow tracked them through the deadly blizzard. She expected the heavy timber door to splinter inward. She expected the cruel men of the town to drag her back to the freezing mud of the auction block. Callahan raised a massive, calloused hand. He offered a very low, soothing hum, a sound specifically meant to calm a terrified creature. He turned his broad back toward her, stepping deliberately between her delicate form and the locked entrance. He grasped the heavy iron latch. He did not hesitate. He ripped the thick door open. A furious blast of freezing wind and blinding white snow screamed into the warm room. Standing on the small wooden porch was the corrupt deputy from the miserable valley below. He was a thin, rat-like man wearing a heavy canvas duster completely caked in white ice. He carried the deeply foul, sharp scent of cheap tavern, whiskey and wet, unwashed wool. His thin face was flushed red from the brutal cold, and his dark eyes gleamed with a toxic mixture of immense greed and arrogant cruelty. He stamped his heavy leather boots against the wooden boards, demanding immediate entry into the warm dwelling. He attempted to push his way past the threshold. Callahan did not move a single inch. He planted his heavy leather boots firmly upon the rough floorboards. His massive shoulders completely filled the entire wooden frame of the doorway. He became an absolute, impenetrable fortress of solid muscle and heavy timber. He stared down at the shivering deputy. The deep brown eyes belonging to the mountain man were entirely devoid of warmth. They were hard, cold, and entirely lethal. The deputy stopped abruptly. He sneered, his thin lips twisting into an ugly, mocking grin. He snapped a harsh demand into the freezing wind. He claimed the town magistrate had reviewed the official ledger. He stated that the massive sum of gold paid in the public square was deeply insufficient. He demanded new, exorbitant administrative fees to fully process the legal paperwork for the purchased woman. He leaned slightly to the side, his cruel eyes attempting to pierce the dark shadows of the cabin to catch a glimpse of the fragile widow. He muttered a deeply offensive remark about the living arrangement, suggesting the terrifying beast of the mountain was heavily enjoying his new property. The physical response from Callahan was terrifying in its absolute silence. He did not shout. He did not throw a violent punch. He simply shifted his immense weight forward. He stepped completely over the wooden threshold, forcing the smaller man to stumble backward into the deep, freezing snowdrift. The sheer, overwhelming dominance of his massive frame radiated pure, physical danger. Callahan delivered a very low, rumbling warning. He stated clearly that the debt was entirely paid in full. He commanded the corrupt official to leave the mountain immediately. He informed the deputy that if he ever returned to the isolated summit, he would absolutely never leave it alive. The short sentences struck like heavy iron hammers. The deputy shook with sudden, uncontrollable terror. The ugly sneer completely vanished from his pale face. He realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that the giant was not bluffing. The solitary trapper lived entirely outside the boundaries of civilized law. He recognized that if he drew the heavy revolver resting upon his hip, the mountain man would absolutely tear him apart with his bare hands. Evelina watched the entire confrontation from the deep shadows of the warm hearth. A profound, overwhelming emotional revelation washed over her trembling spirit. For her entire life, the men she knew had always cowed to harsh authority, constantly passing the heavy burden of their failures onto her fragile shoulders. Her late husband had surrendered her absolute dignity simply to save his own social reputation. Yet, this terrifying stranger stood against the armed law of the valley, risking his own freedom and his own life to defend her absolute safety. He was an unbreakable shield. She felt, truly, completely defended for the very first time since she was a small child. The terrified deputy scrambled backward, desperately creating distance between himself and the towering giant. He reached into the deep pocket of his heavy canvas duster with shaking fingers. He snapped a final, venomous remark into the howling wind. He stated that an urgent message had arrived at the telegraph office in the valley, shortly after the giant had departed the public square. He claimed the magistrate had ordered him to deliver it, but he entirely refused to carry the cursed paper any further. The deputy tossed a small, crumpled yellow envelope onto the wooden floorboards just inside the cabin. He turned and fled into the blinding white storm, his dark silhouette instantly swallowed by the raging blizzard. Callahan stepped backward into the warm cabin. He slammed the heavy timber door shut, completely sealing out the violent winter storm. He lifted a massive iron bar, dropping the heavy metal into the sturdy iron brackets with a loud, final clatter. The absolute, peaceful silence of the isolated dwelling instantly returned, broken only by the soft crackle of the burning logs in the stone hearth. He turned around. He did not look at the yellow envelope resting upon the rough floorboards. He looked directly at Evelina. His deep brown eyes immediately softened, filling with quiet, urgent concern. He watched her pale face closely, deeply searching for any sign of returning fear or physical distress. He offered a gentle nod, silently reassuring her that the immediate threat was entirely gone. Evelina slowly released the frayed fabric of her dark sleeve. She took a hesitant step forward, leaving the comforting warmth of the stone fireplace. The soft leather soles of her scuffed boots moved quietly across the room. She looked down at the crumpled yellow paper resting near the heavy wooden threshold. The official black ink stamped across the front of the telegraph envelope caught the flickering orange light of the fire. The breath completely left her delicate lungs. The deep, terrible dread returned, settling heavily into the pit of her stomach. The sealed envelope was explicitly addressed to the late husband belonging to Evelina. The dark past had found her on the highest peak of the brutal wilderness. She stood completely frozen, staring at the crumpled yellow paper, her mind racing with dark, terrifying possibilities. Exactly what terrible message was written inside that sealed envelope? And what secret from her painful past was about to completely shatter the fragile peace she had finally found? The crumpled yellow paper lay upon the rough floorboards like a venomous serpent waiting to strike. The official black ink stamped across the front of the telegraph envelope caught the flickering orange light of the stone hearth. Evelina stood completely frozen in the center of the quiet cabin. The deep, agonizing dread returned, settling heavily into the pit of her stomach. The cruel, unforgiving world had finally managed to breach the absolute safety of the isolated mountain summit. She took a slow, highly hesitant step forward. Her bare feet felt completely numb against the warm timber. She reached down with pale, trembling fingers and picked up the discarded message. The paper felt damp and incredibly cold from the melting snow left behind by the corrupt deputy. She wrapped her fingers around the thin material. Her breathing turned shallow and highly erratic. She instinctively sought the frayed fabric of her dark cotton sleeve, twisting the rough material over and over to anchor her racing mind against the impending devastation. Callahan remained standing near the heavy oak door. He did not crowd her. He maintained a respectful physical distance, yet his deep brown eyes tracked every single terrified movement she made. He emanated a profound, invisible wave of protective warmth, offering his massive, stoic presence as a silent anchor in the middle of her rising panic. Evelina tore the glued edge of the yellow envelope. She pulled the thin, typed paper from inside. Her hazel eyes scanned the harsh, mechanical letters. The message originated directly from the distant parish of St. Jude, located many miles beyond the miserable valley. The typed words were frantic and entirely direct. The head matron of the parish warned that the corrupt officials from the town had finally discovered the hidden location of the child. The greedy magistrate fully intended to ride up the valley road the very next morning to seize the young girl. The town demanded additional collateral for the massive, unpaid debts of the late husband. The innocent child was destined for a harsh, brutal labor orphanage before the end of the week. The delicate knees belonging to the widow buckled entirely. The remaining strength completely vanished from her fragile limbs. She collapsed toward the hard wooden floorboards. Callahan moved with terrifying, lightning speed. The massive mountain man crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He caught her delicate frame before her knees ever struck the rough timber. He lowered her incredibly gently to the floor, kneeling closely beside her. His heavy, muscular arms formed a secure, unbreakable fortress around her trembling shoulders. The profound physical heat of his broad chest immediately wrapped around her freezing body. A devastating, broken sob tore from the delicate throat belonging to Evelina. She covered her pale face with her trembling hands. The heavy, protective walls of absolute secrecy she had carried for endless, agonizing months finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The tears spilled freely, dropping onto the rough wooden planks. She turned her tear-stained face toward the giant. She confessed the profound, hidden truth. She spoke of Clara, the sweet, highly innocent stepdaughter left behind by the deeply cruel late husband. The young girl was the only pure, beautiful thing in the entirely miserable life belonging to Evelina. The late husband had viewed the child merely as a nuisance, offering no love and demanding absolute silence in his house. But Evelina had raised the little girl with deep, boundless affection. When the crushing debts finally collapsed upon them after the sudden death of the terrible man, the greedy men of the town demanded everything of value. They threatened to take the fragile child. Evelina looked deep into the brown eyes belonging to Callahan. She explained her ultimate, sacred sacrifice. She had deliberately allowed herself to be dragged into the public square. She had willingly stepped onto the humiliating auction block, acting as a highly visible, desperate distraction. She had drawn the cruel attention of the entire valley specifically to buy precious time for a trusted friend to smuggle the young girl out of the town and up the winding valley road to the distant parish. She had completely surrendered her absolute dignity, her personal freedom, and her physical safety just to ensure the innocent child remained entirely hidden from the cruel magistrate. The deep secret name from her terrible fever dream finally possessed a face. She twisted her dark sleeve violently. Her fragile chest heaved with quiet, desperate panic. She fully expected immense anger from the towering mountain man. She fully expected immediate rejection. She had brought a massive, highly dangerous burden into his quiet, peaceful life. She had effectively lied by omission. She waited for him to stand up. She waited for the terrifying beast of the mountain to point toward the freezing door and demand she leave his isolated sanctuary forever. Callahan stared down at the weeping widow. The profound emotional revelation struck his lonely heart with staggering force. The fragile, terrified woman he had purchased from the frozen mud was absolutely not weak. She possessed the fierce, terrifying courage of a mother bear defending a helpless cub. She had walked directly into a living hell to shield a small child who did not even share her own blood. The deep, unspoken admiration inside the stoic trapper multiplied 1,000 times over. He realized she was the bravest human being he had ever met in his entire life. He reached out his massive, calloused hand. He incredibly gently wiped the hot tears from her pale cheek with the rough pad of his heavy thumb. The deliberate touch was a sacred validation of her immense sacrifice. He offered a very low, deep hum of absolute, unquestioning loyalty. He did not utter a single word of complaint. He did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. Callahan stood up slowly. His massive silhouette filled the warm space of the cabin. The entire paradigm of their quiet winter survival shifted permanently. They were no longer simply waiting out the brutal cold. The situation had instantly transformed into a desperate, high-stakes rescue mission. He walked directly toward the heavy wooden chest, resting against the far log wall. He opened the heavy lid and began pulling out thick wool blankets, extra heavy canvas coats, and strong lengths of braided leather rope. He turned toward the small kitchen area. He began packing the heavy canvas sacks with the freshly baked bread and the dried, salted meat. He moved with intense, highly lethal purpose. He looked back at Evelina, his dark eyes burning with pure, absolute determination. He communicated his silent, unbreakable vow. They were leaving immediately. They were going to save the young girl. Evelina stood up on trembling legs. The intense, protective warmth radiating from the giant man gave her sudden, miraculous strength. She wiped her face and reached for her scuffed leather boots. However, a terrible sound vibrated through the heavy timber walls. The raging blizzard outside the cabin screamed with terrifying, escalating violence. The deadly mountain pass waiting beyond the heavy oak door was completely buried under deep, treacherous ice and blinding white powder. The temperature was dropping to highly lethal levels. Could the stoic giant and the fragile widow successfully navigate the deadly, freezing descent through the brutal winter storm before the corrupt town? Officials reached the distant parish and claimed the innocent child first. The heavy oak door groaned loudly as Callahan forced the thick wood open against the screaming winter wind. A blinding wall of pure white snow instantly flooded the warm wooden threshold of the cabin. The absolute fury of the blizzard waiting outside was deeply terrifying. Yet, the towering mountain man did not hesitate for a single second. He pulled his heavy leather collar high against his weathered jaw, stepping completely out into the freezing vortex. Evelina watched from the warm hearth, her heart hammering wildly against her delicate ribs. She hurriedly laced her scuffed leather boots. Her fingers trembled violently, entirely driven by the urgent, desperate need to reach the distant parish. She instinctively sought the frayed fabric of her dark cotton sleeve, twisting the rough material over and over. She was leading this silent protector into profound danger. She was asking a man who owed her nothing to risk his very life. Within moments, Callahan returned to the entrance. He carried the heavy canvas sacks of supplies. He gestured for Evelina to follow him into the storm. She stepped off the wooden porch. The brutal cold immediately stole the breath from her lungs. The snowdrifts were incredibly deep, reaching past her fragile knees. Before she could struggle forward, The massive hands belonging to the giant reached down. He lifted her delicate frame completely out of the deep snow. He carried her through the violent storm with effortless, quiet strength, depositing her gently into the wooden bed of the heavy wagon. He had already constructed a deep, secure nest using the thick wool blankets and heavy bearskins. He wrapped the heavy furs securely around her shivering shoulders, ensuring the brutal wind could not touch her fragile skin. He offered a deeply reassuring, low hum. He brushed a stray snowflake from her pale cheek with the rough pad of his massive thumb. The deliberate, tender action provided a glorious burst of profound warmth in the middle of the freezing nightmare. Callahan climbed onto the wooden bench. The massive draft horses threw their heavy heads, fighting against the blinding snow. He did not steer them toward the main path leading back to the miserable town. Instead, he pulled the heavy leather reins toward the dark, deeply treacherous back side of the mountain. The secret descent was a hidden, narrow trail completely unknown to the cruel men of the valley. It offered a direct route toward the parish, but it was highly dangerous. The heavy iron rims of the wagon wheels ground against the hidden stone. The descent began in absolute darkness. The steep incline was completely covered in a thick layer of slick, black ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. Within the first mile, the severe danger of the journey became completely apparent. The massive horses slipped. The heavy wooden wagon groaned loudly, sliding sideways toward the sheer, terrifying cliff edge dropping into the dark abyss. Callahan leaped from the high wooden bench. He absolutely refused to let the heavy wagon carry Evelina into the dark void. The giant man threw his massive shoulders directly against the heavy timber side of the sliding wagon. He dug his heavy leather boots deeply into the freezing mud and solid ice. He let out a deep, powerful roar of pure physical exertion. The incredible muscles beneath his thick coat strained violently. He physically halted the sliding momentum of the entire heavy vehicle, using nothing but his own immense strength and pure, unbreakable determination. Evelina gasped loudly, clutching the heavy furs. She stared through the blinding snow at the dark silhouette of the giant. He was willingly placing his own heavy body between the crushing weight of the wagon and the deadly cliff edge. It was an act of profound, sacred sacrifice. He was fully prepared to go over the steep edge himself, if it meant keeping her entirely safe. He guided the wagon back onto the narrow path. From that terrifying moment forward, Callahan did not return to the high wooden seat. He walked ahead of the massive draft horses. He marched directly into the teeth of the screaming blizzard. He used his broad chest and powerful legs to physically break the deep snowdrifts, carving a safe path for the heavy animals to follow. He held the thick leather halters in his bare, freezing hands, leading the horses forward inch by agonizing inch. The brutal wind tore at his dark beard and weathered face, completely coating him in a heavy layer of white frost. Evelina watched him through the narrow gap in the thick bearskins. A profound, overwhelming emotional dependence swelled deeply within her chest. She realized she was entirely reliant upon this stoic giant. Every single breath she drew, every single mile she traveled toward her beloved stepdaughter, was purchased entirely by the immense physical suffering belonging to Callahan. The deep emotional walls completely dissolved. The profound gratitude she felt transformed rapidly into an absolute, unbreakable devotion. She knew she would follow this quiet, honorable man to the very edge of the earth. Hours dragged into an agonizing eternity. The dark night slowly gave way to a pale, highly freezing dawn. The roaring wind finally began to lessen as they reached the lower elevation of the vast mountain range. The deep snow thinned, replaced by treacherous, freezing mud and highly jagged slate rock. They were entirely off the main trails, navigating a wild, unbroken valley that stretched for endless miles toward the distant parish. Callahan called a temporary halt. He walked back to the heavy wooden bed. He pulled his thick leather gloves from his deep pockets, warming them against his own chest. He reached under the heavy furs and placed his massive, warm hands completely over the freezing fingers belonging to Evelina. The glorious, returning heat was a profound relief. He looked down into her hazel eyes. His deep brown eyes were heavily exhausted, yet they burned with absolute, quiet determination. He refused to let her give up hope. Evelina pulled one pale hand free. She reached up and very gently touched his freezing, frost-covered cheek. She silently transferred her own small warmth to his weathered skin. He leaned into her highly delicate touch for just a fraction of a second, absorbing the profound emotional connection before turning back toward the difficult path. The massive draft horses resumed their heavy pulling. The distant spire of the old parish finally became visible through the gray morning mist, rising miles away across the jagged valley floor. Hope suddenly flared brightly within the chest of the fragile widow. They were going to make it. They were going to reach the young girl before the corrupt magistrate. Then, a sudden, violent disaster struck. The front iron wheel of the heavy wagon slammed directly into a large, hidden boulder buried beneath the freezing mud. A sharp, deafening crack echoed violently across the silent valley. The heavy, thick wooden spokes of the wheel shattered completely. The front axle collapsed violently toward the hard earth. The entire heavy wagon tilted dramatically to the side, sinking deeply into the wet, freezing clay. The draft horses screamed in panic, straining violently against the heavy leather harnesses. Callahan immediately rushed to calm the massive animals, holding their heavy heads down to prevent them from snapping their thick legs. Evelina threw the heavy furs aside. She stared at the completely destroyed wagon wheel, resting in the freezing mud. They were still miles away from the distant parish. The rugged terrain was far too difficult for a fragile woman to run across. The pale sun was rising fast. The corrupt town officials were surely already riding up the main valley road. The heavy wagon was entirely destroyed miles away from the sanctuary. Exactly how would the exhausted giant and the fragile widow reach the innocent child in time to save her from the cruel orphanage? The shattered wood of the wagon wheel rested uselessly deep within the freezing mud. The pale morning sun broke through the heavy, gray clouds, casting long, desperate shadows across the wild valley. Evelina stood in the freezing clay, staring at the ruined vehicle. She instinctively wrapped her pale, trembling fingers into the frayed fabric of her dark cotton sleeve, twisting the rough material over and over. The profound terror gripping her delicate chest was entirely absolute. They were stranded in the unforgiving wilderness, and the corrupt officials from the valley were surely closing in on the distant parish. Callahan did not waste a single breath on despair. The towering mountain man moved with intense, highly focused urgency. He unbuckled the heavy leather harnesses connecting the massive draft horses to the broken wagon. He stripped away the useless wooden yokes, leaving only the thick riding blankets upon the broad backs of the magnificent animals. He turned toward Evelina. He reached down with his massive, calloused hands, lifting her fragile frame entirely out of the freezing mud. He placed her securely upon the broad back of the largest draft horse, wrapping the thick furs tightly around her shivering legs. He climbed upon the second massive horse. He did not possess a saddle, relying entirely upon his immense balance and highly powerful legs. He grabbed the thick leather halter. He offered a very low, commanding shout into the freezing mist. The massive horses surged forward, leaving the completely destroyed wagon behind. They rode furiously across the jagged slate rock of the valley floor. The freezing wind whipped mercilessly against the weathered face belonging to Callahan. Yet he completely ignored the brutal pain. He drove the heavy horses toward the distant stone spire of the parish with absolute, unyielding determination. The heavy iron gates of St. Jude finally appeared through the thinning fog. A sudden and sharp gasp escaped the pale lips belonging to Evelina. A dark, heavy carriage belonging to the town magistrate was already parked inside the stone courtyard. The cruel men of the valley had beaten them to the sanctuary. Callahan pulled the massive draft horse to a sliding halt near the wrought iron gates. The loud, deeply aggressive voices belonging to the town officials echoed off the high stone walls. The corrupt magistrate stood upon the stone steps of the parish entrance, angrily waving a highly official, rolled document. An elderly matron stood defiantly in the doorway, attempting to block the entrance. Behind the brave matron, a very small, terrified young girl wept bitterly, clutching a highly worn wooden doll against her small chest. It was Clara, the deeply precious stepdaughter belonging to Evelina. The magistrate reached forward, attempting to forcefully shove the elderly matron aside. He absolutely never reached the wooden door. A massive, highly terrifying shadow fell completely over the stone steps. Callahan dismounted from the heavy draft horse. He walked directly into the stone courtyard. His heavy leather boots crushed the loose gravel with deliberate, deafening rhythm. He did not utter a single word. He simply marched toward the stone stairs. An unstoppable, towering force of pure, highly lethal vengeance. The corrupt town officials turned around. The cruel words completely died in their throats. The magistrate stumbled backward, his greedy eyes wide with absolute, highly unadulterated terror. He instantly recognized the terrifying beast of the mountain, the very same giant who had purchased the widow from the public auction block. The official document slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers, fluttering uselessly to the freezing stone below. Callahan stepped firmly onto the stone stairs. He physically placed his massive, highly intimidating frame completely between the cruel men and the terrified young girl. He stared downward, his deep brown eyes burning with a dark, terrifying fury. He did not need to throw a violent punch. The sheer, overwhelming dominance of his towering physical presence radiated pure, deadly consequence. He raised one massive hand. He pointed, a single, thick finger toward the heavy iron gates. He delivered a very low, rumbling command that vibrated deeply within the chests of the frightened men. He demanded they leave the sanctuary immediately. He promised them a highly violent end if they ever approached the innocent child again. The short sentences struck like heavy iron anvils. The corrupt magistrate did not hesitate. He spun around, scrambling frantically toward the dark carriage in complete panic. The deeply coward men of the valley whipped their dark horses, fleeing the stone courtyard in absolute terror. The heavy iron gates clanged shut behind them. The peaceful, absolute silence of the holy parish instantly returned. Evelina slid down from the back of the draft horse. Her delicate legs completely ignored the deep physical exhaustion. She ran across the stone courtyard. A desperate, fractured sob of pure joy tore from her throat. She fell to her knees upon the hard stone, pulling the small, highly terrified girl into her arms. Clara wept loudly, burying her small face deeply into the heavy fur coat worn by Evelina. The profound, emotional reunion was a beautiful, entirely sacred moment of pure salvation. Callahan stepped backward, respectfully leaving a wide space for the fragile widow to embrace her beloved child. The giant man removed his heavy felt hat, holding the dark material against his broad chest. He lowered his dark eyes, heavily respecting the profound bond between the mother and the little girl. Eventually, the soft, highly innocent weeping subsided. Clara pulled her small face away from the dark fabric of the sleeve belonging to Evelina. The young girl turned her head, her bright, tear-filled blue eyes looking directly at the towering giant standing near the stone wall. The physical appearance belonging to Callahan was deeply frightening. He was covered in white frost, heavily scarred, and built like a rugged mountain boulder. Yet, the young girl did not shrink away. The core pillar of absolute innocence allowed her to completely see past the terrifying exterior. Clara took a very slow, hesitant step toward the massive trapper. Callahan froze completely. A sudden wave of highly unfamiliar panic washed over his stoic features. He had faced heavily armed deputies and brutal winter blizzards without blinking. Yet the slow approach of the tiny, fragile child terrified him deeply. He slowly lowered his massive frame, dropping heavily onto one knee to avoid towering over the young girl. He extended one massive, deeply calloused hand, keeping his movements incredibly slow and highly gentle. Clara reached out. Her tiny, delicate fingers gently touched the heavy, rough thumb belonging to the giant. The glorious, epic, profound warmth of his absolute protection radiated directly into her small hand. She smiled. It was a beautiful, entirely trusting expression that struck the lonely heart belonging to Callahan with the force of a falling star. Evelina watched the magnificent interaction from the cold stone. The deep, unspoken attachment within her battered soul multiplied significantly. She witnessed the highly terrifying beast of the isolated mountain, showing infinite, beautiful tenderness to the only thing she truly loved in the entire world. The profound realization settled into her bones. She was falling deeply into a sacred, undeniable devotion to the silent protector. The heavy gray clouds above began to slowly part, revealing a pale, beautiful patch of winter blue. Clara looked deeply into the kind brown eyes belonging to the giant. She tilted her small head, completely devoid of any fear. She asked a highly simple, deeply fragile question in a soft, musical whisper. She asked the towering mountain man if he was her completely new father. The stoic heart belonging to Callahan completely stopped beating in his massive chest. Exactly how would the highly guarded, solitary trapper react to a profound question that completely terrified his lonely, isolated soul? Handed the soft, highly musical question from the young girl, hung suspended in the freezing air of the stone courtyard. Callahan remained perfectly still upon his heavy knee. The massive mountain man, capable of physically halting a sliding wagon, was completely disarmed by the absolute innocence belonging to the child. He swallowed hard. A profound, deeply painful vulnerability flashed across his dark eyes. He had lived his entire adult life believing his rough, heavily scarred exterior made him entirely unworthy of such a beautiful, sacred title. He did not possess the elegant words to answer her. He feared his deep, rumbling voice would frighten her away. Instead, he reached into the deep pocket of his heavy canvas coat. He withdrew a very small, perfectly smooth wooden bird he had carved from white birch during the long, lonely nights upon the mountain. He placed the small wooden figure into the tiny, delicate hands belonging to Clara. He offered a very low, gentle hum. His calloused fingers brushed against her small knuckles with infinite, terrifying care. It was a deeply silent, beautiful promise. His actions spoke the profound truth his guarded heart could not yet voice. Evelina stepped forward across the cold stone, rescuing the highly overwhelmed giant. She gathered Clara into her arms, whispering soft, joyful reassurances into the bright golden hair belonging to the young girl. The journey back to the isolated summit was exceedingly slow, yet it lacked the desperate, freezing terror of the previous day. Callahan secured a new, heavy wooden wheel for the wagon from the brave parish matron. They rode up the winding valley path as the pale winter sun broke completely through the heavy gray clouds. Evelina sat upon the high wooden bench beside the towering woodsman, holding Clara safely beneath the thick firs. The absolute, heavy presence belonging to the silent protector completely shielded them from the biting wind. When they finally crossed the heavy timber threshold of the mountain cabin, the stagnant, this deeply lonely atmosphere of the dwelling had permanently vanished. Callahan stoked the glowing red embers in the massive stone hearth into a roaring, bright orange fire. The glorious, deeply comforting scent of warming bread and rich pine immediately filled the heavy timber room. Clara sat upon the thick bearskins in the center of the wooden floorboards, laughing brightly as she made the small wooden bird fly through the warm air. The sweet, highly innocent sound of her laughter echoed against the ancient log walls. It was a profoundly beautiful, deeply healing sound that the heavy timber cabin had never before known. Callahan stood near the cast iron stove, entirely mesmerized by the magnificent sight. He washed his massive, calloused hands in the ceramic basin, watching the small child and the beautiful widow with absolute, quiet reverence. The core pillar of second chances bloomed deeply within his isolated soul. He had spent 10 long years believing he was completely destined to die alone in the brutal wilderness. He had accepted a life devoid of human warmth. Yet, a vibrant, beautiful makeshift family had miraculously blossomed inside his lonely, freezing fortress. He stepped quietly toward the heavy wooden table. He placed a small, warm piece of baked bread near the playing child. Clara looked up, offering a brilliant, entirely trusting smile. The giant man offered a small, highly hesitant smile in return, a completely rare expression that entirely transformed his rugged, weathered face, revealing the profound gentleness hidden beneath his terrifying exterior. During the warm evening meal, the three of them sat around the heavy timber table. Callahan did not speak, but he continuously pushed the largest portions of roasted root vegetables and cured meat toward the ceramic bowls belonging to Evelina and Clara. He drank only plain hot water, ensuring the fragile mother and child consumed the rich, healing broth. Evelina noticed his completely selfless actions. She felt a deep, overwhelming surge of pure affection swell within her throat. She wanted desperately to reach across the rough wood and hold his massive hand, to press her delicate lips against his scarred knuckles, and confess the deep, profound gratitude consuming her soul. But the heavy, unyielding fear of overstepping her boundaries held her entirely frozen. She watched the towering woodsman from the opposite side of the warm room. She instinctively wrapped her pale fingers into the frayed fabric of her dark cotton sleeve, twisting the rough material over and over. The tense, entirely unspoken longing within her fragile chest grew into a brilliant, consuming flame. She admired the gentle, deliberate way he moved his massive frame to avoid frightening the young girl. She noticed the profound, unmistakable respect shining in his deep brown eyes every single time he looked her way. Yet, a highly painful, deeply sobering realization settled into her battered spirit. She was completely, entirely emotionally dependent upon this giant man. The cruel world below the snowline held absolutely nothing for her but deep suffering and harsh judgment. Her entire world, her absolute safety, and the beautiful future belonging to her beloved stepdaughter, now rested completely within the heavy, calloused hands belonging to Callahan. She had absolutely nothing of material value to offer him in return for his immense, unending sacrifices. The dark, heavily ingrained insecurities from her cruel past whispered highly toxic lies into her recovering mind. She feared she was an immense, highly unfair burden to the stoic trapper. He had surrendered his entire life savings to purchase her freedom from the muddy public square. He had risked his very life on the highly deadly ice of the mountain pass. He had completely surrendered his peaceful, solitary existence, giving up his own warm bed to protect two fragile strangers. She worried desperately that eventually, the massive mountain man would deeply desire his quiet, unburdened freedom once again. The dark purple shadows of the deep winter night eventually swallowed the mountain's summit. The howling wind returned, whipping fiercely against the heavy log walls. Evelina and Clara slept deeply upon the soft mattress, wrapped entirely in the heavy, warm furs. The absolute silence of the interior returned. A peaceful, heavy quietness built upon complete physical safety. Suddenly, a very soft, highly deliberate sound awakened the fragile widow. She opened her hazel eyes, peering cautiously through the dark shadows of the quiet cabin. The bright yellow light of the dying fire illuminated the towering silhouette belonging to Callahan. He was not resting upon his rough blankets near the heavy front door. He was standing near the large wooden table, moving with intense, highly focused urgency. He was fully dressed in his heavy winter coat. He was quietly packing his heavy canvas gear. He secured extra braided leather rope, checked the sharp edge of his heavy hunting knife, and quietly loaded his thick, heavy hunting rifle in the absolute dead of the freezing night. He moved with the highly lethal, silent grace of a wild predator preparing for a brutal hunt. He slung the heavy leather strap of the rifle over his broad shoulder. He turned toward the heavy oak door, his face completely masked by the deep shadows. A sharp, cold spike of pure panic pierced the fragile heart belonging to Evelina. The protective walls of her newfound sanctuary suddenly felt entirely fragile. Exactly where into the deadly, frozen wilderness was the silent protector going? And was the towering giant quietly leaving the makeshift family behind forever? The heavy oak door closed with a very soft, highly deliberate click. Evelina remained completely frozen upon the soft mattress, staring into the dark shadows of the silent cabin. The towering mountain man had slipped away into the brutal, freezing wilderness. He had not abandoned the fragile makeshift family. The profound realization settled deeply into her racing mind. The giant had realized the small supply of salted meat was entirely insufficient to feed a growing child through the endless winter. He had ventured out into the deadly, pitch-black night, risking his own survival to hunt for fresh sustenance, ensuring the fragile mother and child would absolutely never know the terrible pain of starvation. The slow, agonizing hours dragged toward the pale dawn. The howling wind outside the heavy log walls eventually died down, replaced by a highly tense, absolute stillness. The bright winter sun broke completely over the eastern peaks, casting a sharp, blinding light across the deep snow. Evelina rose from the heavy bearskins. She moved quietly across the rough floorboards, her delicate chest tight with deep, unrelenting anxiety. She instinctively wrapped her pale, trembling fingers into the frayed fabric of her dark cotton sleeve, twisting the rough material over and over. She peered through the single frosted window. The vast expanse of white snow remained completely unbroken. The silent protector had not returned. Clara awoke, sitting up and rubbing her bright blue eyes. The young girl offered a highly innocent, sweet smile, immediately reaching for the small wooden bird. Evelina returned the smile, masking her profound terror with a highly practiced, gentle calmness. She stoked the hot embers inside the cast iron stove, placing the heavy iron kettle over the yellow flames. Suddenly, a heavy, deeply wet thud struck the thick wooden planks of the front porch. It was not a knock. It was the terrifying sound of a massive, dead weight collapsing completely against the heavy timber door. Evelina dropped the wooden spoon. She sprinted across the room, her delicate hands grasping the heavy iron bar. She lifted the thick metal, throwing the heavy door wide open. A sharp, devastating gasp tore violently from her fragile throat. Callahan lay sprawled across the freezing wooden threshold. The towering giant had completely fallen. His massive frame was covered in thick, dark mud and bright white snow. His heavy canvas coat was violently shredded across his broad right shoulder, completely soaked in a terrifying amount of deep crimson blood. He had successfully tracked a massive elk through a highly treacherous, jagged slate ravine, but a brutal, collapsing rock ledge had sent him plummeting down the sheer cliff. The sharp stones had carved a horrific, deeply lethal gash across his muscular back. He had dragged his own broken, bleeding body for endless miles through the freezing snow, refusing to die in the wild specifically because he knew the fragile widow and the innocent child depended entirely upon his return. He lifted his heavy, weathered head with immense, agonizing effort. His deep brown eyes, highly glazed with intense physical trauma, met the terrified hazel eyes belonging to Evelina. He attempted to offer a low, reassuring hum, but his voice completely failed. The final ounce of his immense physical strength vanished. The massive mountain man collapsed face forward onto the rough floorboards, completely losing consciousness. The deep, heavy walls of panic inside the fragile widow threatened to completely swallow her mind. The cruel world had always demanded she surrender during a crisis. And, however, a profound, highly powerful emotional reversal took complete control of her battered spirit. This terrifying giant had repeatedly placed his massive body between her fragile life and absolute destruction. He had completely surrendered his gold, his warm bed, and his personal safety for her absolute dignity. She completely refused to let him die. She knelt beside his massive, motionless form. Her delicate frame was vastly smaller than the towering woodsman's, but pure, absolute devotion provided a miraculous, sudden strength. She grabbed the heavy, blood-soaked collar of his thick canvas coat. She planted her scuffed leather boots firmly against the rough wooden threshold. She leaned backward, pulling with every single ounce of physical power in her slender arms. With a desperate, highly strained cry, she dragged the heavy, immovable weight belonging to the giant completely over the wooden threshold, securing his massive body inside the warm cabin. She kicked the heavy oak door shut, instantly sealing out the freezing cold. Clara ran forward, her tiny face filled with deep concern. The sweet child carried a soft wool blanket and the highly precious wooden bird. She placed the small wooden figure very gently beside the heavy, calloused hand belonging to the bleeding trapper, offering her own beautiful, highly innocent comfort. Evelina offered a swift, deeply gentle touch to the golden hair belonging to the young girl, instructing her to sit bravely near the warm stone hearth. Evelina turned her entire, intense focus completely upon the severe wound. She utilized the deep, profound homemaking skills that had previously defined her quiet domestic life, weaponizing her gentle knowledge to achieve pure salvation. She ran to the small kitchen area, grabbing her small woven sewing basket, the remaining dried silver willow bark, and the white yarrow flowers. She retrieved the heavy wooden basin of boiling water from the hot stove. Returning to the fallen giant, she used her small, sharp sewing scissors to completely cut away the heavy, ruined canvas and the thick flannel shirt, exposing the massive, highly muscular back belonging to Callahan. The brutal laceration was terrifying. It was deep, highly jagged, and bleeding continuously. Evelina did not flinch. She soaked a clean linen cloth in the boiling, herb-infused water. She worked with highly astonishing, intricate delicacy, cleaning the dark mud and freezing snow from the torn flesh. The glorious heat of the water caused the massive muscles belonging to the unconscious giant to completely shudder. She leaned forward, using the soft, highly clean linen to very gently wipe the cold sweat from his pale forehead, offering a profound, highly intimate touch of absolute reassurance. She opened her small sewing basket. She threaded her finest silver needle with thick, heavy silk thread. The highly delicate, beautiful sewing skills belonging to the widow, previously utilized only to mend soft lace and thin cotton dresses, suddenly became the exact mechanism of his absolute survival. She pressed the torn edges of the heavy flesh together. Her pale, delicate fingers moved with incredible, exact precision. She stitched the horrific wound closed, securing the dark skin tightly to stop the heavy flow of crimson blood. The profound contrast was deeply emotional. The small, fragile hands belonging to the delicate woman completely dominated the massive, highly powerful body belonging to the untamed woodsman, bringing absolute healing to his heavily scarred exterior. She crushed the highly potent yarrow flowers into a thick, wet paste, packing the medicine completely over the fresh stitches. She tore a completely clean, white cotton petticoat from her own spare garments, binding the broad chest belonging to the giant with highly tight, secure layers of pure white cloth. As she finished tying the final, secure knot, the heavy eyelids belonging to Callahan slowly fluttered open. His dark, pain-filled eyes focused slowly upon the beautiful, highly determined face hovering above him. He felt the highly secure, tight bandages wrapping his broad chest. He felt the incredibly soft, delicate hand resting highly gently against his weathered cheek. A profound, overwhelming realization washed over his isolated soul. The highly fragile woman he had sworn to protect had completely saved his life. He closed his eyes, offering a very weak, incredibly low hum of absolute gratitude. He found complete, unquestioning safety inside her gentle touch. Evelina sat heavily upon the wooden floorboards, her delicate chest heaving with deep, physical exhaustion. She maintained her highly protective grip upon his massive hand, absolutely refusing to leave his side. The dark shadows of the evening eventually consumed the heavy timber cabin. The raging fire inside the stone hearth provided absolute warmth. Yet a highly terrifying, invisible enemy crept into the quiet room. The thick, weathered skin belonging to Callahan suddenly grew highly flushed and deeply hot. A terrible, burning fever began to rage completely through his massive body. Dark, violent red lines began to slowly creep outward from beneath the highly secure white bandages, signaling a deep, severe infection. The giant man began to completely tremble violently against the hard floorboards, trapped in a highly terrifying delirium. The delicate, highly precise stitches had completely stopped the bleeding. But exactly how would the fragile widow battle the highly deadly internal poison threatening to completely consume the silent protector before the arrival of the pale winter dawn? The heavy timber cabin felt entirely suffocating under the crushing weight of the rising fever. The massive body belonging to Callahan trembled violently against the hard floorboards. The deep, dark red lines of severe infection crawled slowly outward from the edges of the white cotton bandages binding his broad chest. Evelina knelt beside him in the dark shadows, her delicate knees completely numb from the rough wood. She dipped the clean linen cloth into the freezing water basin over and over. She pressed the glorious, cooling relief against the burning forehead belonging to the giant. Clara slept peacefully upon the heavy bearskins across the room, completely unaware of the highly terrifying battle for survival occurring near the stone hearth. Evelina instinctively sought the frayed fabric of her dark cotton sleeve. She twisted the rough material tightly, her hazel eyes brimming with desperate, hot tears. The cruel world had taken absolutely everything from her, but she absolutely refused to let the dark wilderness take this magnificent, honorable man. The highly agonizing hours of the deep night dragged forward. The roaring fire inside the stone fireplace burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, deeply trembling shadows across the peeling log walls. Suddenly, the violent trembling belonging to Callahan ceased. The massive trapper grew completely still. His breathing became incredibly shallow, a fragile, deeply ragged sound that completely terrified the delicate widow. He slowly opened his dark brown eyes. The highly chaotic, burning delirium had briefly cleared, replaced by a profound, deeply devastating clarity. He believed he was taking his final, highly painful breaths. The absolute certainty of his impending death completely stripped away the heavy, unyielding emotional armor he had worn for 10 long years. He moved his massive, heavily scarred hand across the rough timber floor. He sought the small, delicate fingers belonging to Evelina. She immediately grasped his heavy palm, intertwining her pale fingers with his rough calluses, offering a profound, desperate anchor in the dark. He turned his weathered face toward the dying fire. His deep voice broke the absolute silence of the lonely cabin. It was a highly fragile, incredibly raw whisper, completely devoid of his usual, highly commanding rumble. He confessed his darkest, most painful fear directly into the empty night. He spoke of his deep, heavily ingrained ugliness. He described himself as a highly terrifying beast, a heavily scarred monster fit only for the brutal, isolated mountain. He confessed that the deeply cruel men of the valley were entirely correct to fear him. He whispered that his hands were far too rough, his soul far too completely broken to ever properly care for a highly beautiful, deeply gentle woman. He admitted he had surrendered his life savings because he could not bear to see her suffer on the block, but he completely expected her to leave the lonely summit the very moment the winter snow melted. He believed he possessed absolutely nothing of true, lasting value to offer a delicate lady. The profound, highly devastating confession struck the fragile heart belonging to Evelina with staggering, absolute force. The core pillar of emotional redemption bloomed beautifully within her chest. The silent protector had shielded her from the entire world. Yet he was completely defenseless against his own deeply wounded mind. She completely released the frayed fabric of her dark sleeve. She absolutely refused to hide behind her nervous habit any longer. She moved closer, leaning directly over the massive, highly vulnerable giant. She reached out with her free hand. She pressed her delicate, highly soft palm firmly against the heavily scarred cheek belonging to Callahan. She forced him to look directly into her highly tear-filled hazel eyes. She spoke with absolute, unbreakable conviction. She completely rejected his dark, highly toxic fears. She whispered that the polished, highly wealthy gentlemen of the valley possessed completely dark, entirely rotting souls. She explained that true, profound beauty did not exist in fine silk coats or smooth, unblemished skin. It existed in the highly absolute, pure sacrifice he had made in the freezing public square. It existed in the incredibly gentle, highly careful way he held a small wooden bird for a terrified child. It existed in the heavy, warm coat he had placed upon her freezing shoulders during the deadly wagon ride. She leaned closer, her soft breath washing completely over his weathered face. She declared that his massive, highly scarred heart was constructed entirely of pure, unbreakable gold. She validated his absolute worth, promising highly fiercely that she possessed absolutely no desire to ever leave his side. The beautiful, profound truth settled deeply into the isolated, lonely soul belonging to the mountain man. A single, highly rare tear escaped the dark corner of his eye, rolling slowly across his weathered skin. The deep, heavy chains of his profound insecurity shattered completely. He closed his eyes, entirely surrendering to the profound, absolute safety of her gentle touch. The ultimate vulnerability brought a miraculous, sudden peace. The burning heat radiating from his massive chest slowly began to recede. The potent white yarrow flowers and the absolutely pure, sacred emotional connection fought back the highly deadly infection. By the time the pale winter dawn broke through the single frosted window, the terrible fever had completely broken. The silent protector had survived the darkest, most highly terrifying night. Weeks slowly turned into long, beautiful, healing months. The brutal winter storms finally completely surrendered their icy grip upon the high mountain. The deep, heavy snow began to melt, transforming into rushing, highly musical streams of clear water. The warm, beautiful breath of early spring washed completely over the isolated summit. Green, highly vibrant pine shoots pushed through the dark, thawing earth. Callahan recovered his immense, highly formidable physical strength. The terrible laceration healed into a thick, heavily faded scar, completely hidden beneath his fresh flannel shirts. The makeshift family thrived beautifully in the warm sunlight. The heavy timber cabin echoed constantly with the sweet, highly innocent laughter belonging to Clara. The profound, deeply unspoken longing between the giant and the widow intensified into a highly beautiful, completely undeniable devotion. However, the cruel, highly unforgiving world below the snowline absolutely refused to forget the unpaid debts. One bright, highly sunny afternoon, a lone rider approached the isolated summit. It was not the corrupt deputy, but a young, highly terrified messenger boy from the valley. He rode his completely exhausted horse into the clearing, dropped a highly official, heavily sealed envelope upon the wooden porch, and fled immediately back down the winding mountain path. Callahan stood near the chopping block, his heavy iron axe resting motionless in his massive hands. Evelina stepped completely out onto the wooden porch. The gentle, highly warm spring breeze pulled at the soft waves of her chestnut hair. She picked up the heavy white envelope. She broke the highly official red wax seal. She unfolded the stiff, highly formal parchment. The words printed upon the page completely stopped the beating of her fragile heart. The highly corrupt magistrate of the valley had officially declared the public auction completely void. The legal document claimed the massive sum of gold paid by the mountain man was legally insufficient to cover the newly discovered, highly exorbitant hidden penalties attached to the estate belonging to the late husband. The harsh valley law demanded the immediate surrender of the fragile widow. The magistrate promised to send a heavily armed posse to the mountain summit by the end of the week to drag her entirely back to the dark, freezing debtor prison. The glorious, highly beautiful peace of the spring afternoon instantly shattered into a million deeply jagged pieces. Exactly how would the towering giant protect the beautiful widow when the completely absolute, heavy weight of the formal law threatened to entirely tear their beautiful makeshift family apart forever? The stiff, highly formal parchment completely slipped from the trembling fingers belonging to Evelina. It fluttered against the warm spring breeze, landing face down upon the rough wooden boards of the front porch. The bright, highly beautiful sunshine of the afternoon suddenly felt incredibly cold. The deep, heavy dread returned, completely swallowing the fragile joy she had found upon the isolated summit. The corrupt men of the miserable valley absolutely refused to let her exist in peace. They demanded she return to the freezing darkness of the debtor prison, threatening to send a heavily armed posse to drag her away from the towering giant and her beloved stepdaughter. The heavy iron axe belonging to Callahan struck the chopping block with a deafening, highly violent crack, splitting a massive oak log entirely in half. He heard the sharp, terrifying gasp escape her delicate throat. He dropped the heavy tool immediately. He crossed the clearing in 3 massive strides, his heavy leather boots crushing the damp, highly fragrant spring earth. He stepped onto the wooden porch, his dark brown eyes filled with immediate, deep concern. He looked at the pale, highly terrified face belonging to the fragile widow. Then, he looked down at the official parchment resting near her scuffed leather boots. He bent his massive frame, picking up the heavy paper with his calloused hands. His dark eyes scanned the harsh, printed words. The physical transformation belonging to the mountain man was deeply terrifying. The gentle, nestart, highly quiet trapper completely vanished. The massive muscles in his broad shoulders tensed into solid rock. His heavy jaw clenched tightly, and a highly dangerous, completely lethal silence radiated from his towering frame. He absolutely refused to let the cruel men of the valley take the fragile woman who had completely saved his life. He reached out, then, incredibly gently placing his massive hand over the trembling shoulder belonging to Evelina. He offered a very low, deeply resolute hum. It was a completely unbreakable vow. He guided her safely back inside the heavy timber cabin, completely sealing the heavy oak door against the outside world. The core pillar of sacred sacrifice took complete control of the stoic giant. Callahan walked directly toward the dark, heavily shadowed back corner of the large room. He stood completely still before the heavy oak door, secured by the massive, rusted iron padlock. For 10 long years, he had kept this heavy door completely sealed. He reached beneath his flannel shirt, retrieving a highly worn iron key resting against his broad chest upon a thick leather cord. He inserted the heavy metal into the rusted lock. A loud, highly metallic click echoed through the quiet cabin. He removed the heavy iron lock and pulled the thick door open. Evelina watched from the stone hearth, instinctively wrapping her pale, trembling fingers into the frayed fabric of her dark cotton sleeve. She twisted the rough material over and over, her hazel eyes wide with deep, fearful curiosity. Callahan stepped completely into the small, highly dark storage room. He returned a moment later, carrying a heavy, highly polished wooden box bound in dark iron. He placed the heavy box directly upon the rough timber table, He opened the highly secure metal clasp. Inside, resting upon faded velvet, was a thick, highly official stack of heavy parchment documents. It was the complete, highly legal deed to the entire mountain summit. The solitary trapper owned the massive, heavily timbered peak entirely. It was his absolute sanctuary, his complete soul, and the only place in the entire world where he felt truly safe from the deeply cruel judgment of civilized men. He pulled the heavy documents from the wooden box. He turned toward Evelina. He stated highly firmly, his deep voice carrying absolutely no hesitation, that he intended to ride down to the valley at first light. He planned to sell his completely cherished mountain to the greedy town officials, to fully satisfy the highly corrupt, entirely fabricated penalty. He was fully prepared to completely surrender his eternal home, to purchase her absolute, permanent freedom. And the profound, deeply devastating realization struck the fragile widow with staggering force. She rushed forward, completely releasing the dark fabric of her sleeve. She placed her highly delicate hands completely over the heavy, calloused fingers belonging to the giant. She begged him highly desperately not to commit such a terrible sacrifice. She explained that the mountain was his entire life. She whispered, highly frantic, that if he surrendered his beautiful sanctuary to the greedy town, he would absolutely lose his highly honorable spirit. He would become a deeply broken wanderer for her sake. Callahan looked down at her small, pale hands resting completely upon his massive knuckles. He shook his head highly slowly. He offered a very deep, incredibly soft rumble. He declared firmly that the heavy timber cabin was merely cold wood, and the high peak was merely frozen stone. He gently touched her pale cheek with the rough pad of his heavy thumb. He stated completely clearly that she and the young girl were his true home. Without them, the entire mountain possessed absolutely no value. Clara ran across the wooden floorboards, completely sensing the heavy emotional distress. The young girl hugged the thick canvas leg belonging to the giant. Callahan immediately stooped down, lifting the highly fragile child into his massive, muscular arms. He rested his heavy chin completely upon her golden hair, holding her securely against his broad chest. The highly vivid, deeply beautiful picture of the towering protector shielding the innocent child brought fresh, highly agonizing tears to the hazel eyes belonging to Evelina. The dark shadows of the spring evening eventually fell entirely across the isolated summit. The heavy threat of deep separation hung suffocatingly in the warm air of the cabin. Evelina prepared a completely silent supper, but the highly rich food tasted exactly like dry ashes. Callahan packed his heavy leather satchel with the official deeds and the remaining gold coins. He sat heavily in the wooden chair near the roaring stone hearth, his heavy hunting rifle resting across his broad knees. He intended to guard the front door until the pale dawn. However, the deep, defiant, emotional exhaustion of the highly stressful day eventually claimed his mind. His heavy eyes closed, and his deep, steady breathing filled the quiet room. The midnight hour arrived with a highly tense, completely absolute stillness. Evelina lay entirely awake upon the soft mattress. She stared at the deeply peaceful, heavily scarred face belonging to the sleeping giant. A profoundly devastating, highly terrible truth settled completely into her battered mind. The highly corrupt men of the miserable valley would absolutely never stop. If the giant surrendered the mountain, the cruel magistrate would simply consume the immense wealth and eventually demand more. The greedy town would completely drain the highly honorable man until he possessed absolutely nothing left. And then they would drag her to the freezing prison anyway. She absolutely could not allow the magnificent, deeply beautiful soul, belonging to the silent protector, to be completely destroyed by the dark shadow of her own ruined past. The fragile widow made a highly devastating, completely unbreakable decision. She rose completely silently from the heavy bearskins. She moved across the rough floorboards like a highly delicate ghost. She dressed in her dark, faded cotton dress and laced her highly scuffed leather boots. She walked softly toward the small wooden table. Using a piece of dark charcoal, she wrote a deeply delicate, highly tear-stained note upon a scrap of rough paper. She placed the final farewell, highly gently beside the small wooden bird belonging to Clara. She walked toward the sleeping mountain man. She leaned deeply forward, placing a highly soft, incredibly fleeting kiss directly upon his weathered, heavily scarred forehead. It was an act of pure, absolute devotion, a deeply agonizing goodbye to the only man who had ever treated her with true dignity. Evelina completely unlatched the heavy oak door. She slipped out into the dark, incredibly cold spring night, leaving the absolute safety of the isolated cabin entirely behind. She began the highly terrifying, deeply lonely walk down the winding mountain path toward the cruel valley, entirely determined to surrender herself to the greedy magistrate to spare the giant from losing his cherished home. The heavy shadows of the tall pines swallowed her delicate frame completely. Exactly what highly devastating consequences awaited her in the miserable town? And would the towering mountain man awaken in time to discover the deeply empty bed before she surrendered her absolute freedom forever? The pale, deeply gray light of the early morning crept slowly through the single frosted window of the heavy timber cabin. The deep, highly rhythmic breathing belonging to the massive mountain man finally shifted. Callahan opened his dark brown eyes. The roaring fire inside the massive stone hearth had completely burned down to highly cold, gray ash. A profound, deeply unnatural silence filled the large room. The absolute stillness struck the highly finely tuned instincts belonging to the solitary trapper like a physical blow. He stood up instantly. The heavy hunting rifle slipped from his broad knees, clattering loudly against the rough floorboards. He looked directly toward the heavy wooden bed. The thick bearskins were completely pushed aside. Clara slept deeply upon the soft mattress, but the space beside the young girl was entirely empty. The towering giant crossed the room in two massive strides. He saw the highly delicate, heavily tear-stained note resting upon the rough wood of the table. It was placed highly carefully beside the small, deeply cherished wooden bird. He picked up the highly fragile scrap of paper. The heavy, calloused fingers belonging to Callahan trembled violently. The highly honorable mountain man could not read the delicate cursive letters, but the dark, heavily smeared charcoal and the deep, wet tear stains communicated the highly devastating truth entirely. The fragile widow had completely surrendered herself. She had walked directly back into the freezing jaws of the cruel world, simply to save the eternal sanctuary belonging to the giant. A highly terrifying, entirely pure desperation exploded completely inside the massive chest belonging to Callahan. The highly stoic protector had faced brutal blizzards, charging bears, and highly deadly cliffs without a single flinch. Yet, the absolute terror of losing the gentle, highly beautiful woman completely shattered his deeply guarded soul. He realized highly profoundly that his immense physical strength was completely useless if he could not protect the highly fragile heart he had grown to completely depend upon. The deep, highly invisible bond they shared was absolutely worth any price, any danger, and any extreme sacrifice. He possessed profound courage, and he instantly forgave her deeply foolish, highly dangerous choice, because he completely understood the pure, absolute devotion driving her tiny footsteps. He moved with highly lethal, explosive speed. He secured the heavy oak door from the outside, locking the sleeping child safely within the deeply impenetrable timber walls. He ran directly toward the wooden stable. He did not bother with the heavy leather harnesses or the completely repaired wooden wagon. He threw a highly thick riding blanket over the broad back of his largest, most powerful draft horse. He grasped the heavy leather mane with his bare, highly calloused hands. He launched his massive frame completely onto the back of the magnificent animal. He delivered a highly aggressive, deeply urgent shout into the freezing morning air. The massive horse surged forward, plunging completely down the highly dangerous, winding mountain path. The highly reckless descent was deeply terrifying. The heavy iron horseshoes struck the jagged slate rock, throwing bright yellow sparks into the fading darkness. Sharp pine branches whipped violently against the weathered face belonging to Callahan. The heavy, sharp thorns tore highly deeply through his heavy canvas coat. He completely ignored the sharp, physical pain. He drove the heavy beast forward with absolute, highly unrelenting fury. The sun, profoundly dark shadows of the tall pines rushed past his broad shoulders. The deep, emotional walls completely dissolved in the freezing winter wind. He fully recognized that living completely alone upon the highly secure summit was absolutely meaningless if the highly gentle, incredibly beautiful widow was not sitting safely beside the warm stone hearth. He fully embraced his complete emotional dependence. He absolutely refused to let the dark, heavily corrupt valley steal his bright, beautiful salvation. The massive draft horse thundered down the treacherous slope, completely closing the vast distance separating the high, pure snow from the deeply muddy valley below. The highly miserable town finally appeared through the deeply freezing morning mist. The deep, heavy mud of the valley floor completely replaced the pure, highly pristine snow of the high mountain. The deeply muddy streets were highly quiet, filled only with the dark shadows of the early dawn. The massive draft horse thundered down the main avenue, completely tearing up the frozen mud. Callahan pulled the heavy beast toward the large stone building belonging to the corrupt magistrate. The highly cruel town officials were already awake, completely preparing the dark, heavy iron bars of the deeply freezing debtor prison. Standing completely alone upon the highly cold stone steps was Evelina. The fragile widow looked incredibly pale, highly exhausted from the deeply terrifying, entirely lonely walk down the dark mountain pass. The biting morning wind whipped the highly thin, faded fabric of her dark cotton dress against her highly slender frame. She stood completely frozen, instinctively wrapping her highly trembling pale fingers directly into the frayed fabric of her sleeve. She twisted the highly rough material over and over. She kept her highly beautiful hazel eyes lowered completely toward the freezing mud. She fully believed her highly agonizing sacrifice was the only possible way to completely spare the towering giant from losing his cherished home. She forgave the cruel world for its highly unfair demands, finding deep, profound courage in the pure, absolute devotion she held for the silent protector. The highly corrupt magistrate stood before her. A deeply ugly, highly mocking sneer completely twisted his greedy face. Two heavily armed guards stepped forward, carrying thick, highly rusted iron shackles. They reached heavily toward the highly delicate wrists belonging to Evelina. She closed her highly tear-filled hazel eyes. She prepared to completely surrender her absolute freedom forever. Suddenly, a highly violent, incredibly deafening roar completely shattered the cold morning silence. It was a deeply terrifying sound of pure, highly absolute primal fury. The corrupt magistrate spun around, his highly cruel face draining completely of all color. The two heavily armed guards instantly dropped the heavy iron shackles onto the hard stone. The heavy metal clattered loudly against the frozen steps. The massive draft horse completely breached the stone courtyard, rearing highly aggressively into the pale winter sky. Callahan leaped from the highly broad back of the animal before the heavy hooves even struck the muddy earth. The massive mountain man landed heavily upon the freezing stone, rising completely to his full, highly terrifying height. His heavy canvas coat fluttered violently in the freezing wind. His heavily scarred face was completely locked in absolute, highly lethal determination. His dark brown eyes burned with a completely unstoppable, deeply dangerous fire. He had completely traversed the highly deadly mountain path in the absolute dark. He had completely abandoned his highly secure fortress specifically to reach her. Before the heavy iron bars closed, he found the highly beautiful, completely fragile widow standing highly perilously before the heavily armed guards belonging to the corrupt magistrate. Exactly what highly devastating consequence would follow, and would the deeply terrifying, highly aggressive intervention belonging to the towering giant completely save the fragile woman, or entirely doom them both to the dark, freezing darkness of the debtor prison? The heavily armed guards stepped backward instantly. The highly terrifying, absolute fury radiating from the towering mountain man completely paralyzed the cruel men of the valley. Callahan marched directly up the freezing stone steps. He did not throw a violent punch. He did not draw the heavy hunting rifle resting upon his broad back. The highly honorable trapper completely refused to let the deeply corrupt, highly miserable town drag his beautiful salvation into a world of physical violence. Instead, he intended to completely crush their dark cruelty with absolute, undeniable validation. He placed his massive, highly intimidating frame completely between the trembling widow and the greedy town officials. The heavy leather boots belonging to the giant planted firmly upon the stone, establishing an absolute, highly impenetrable fortress of protection. He reached into the heavy leather satchel, resting against his highly muscular side. He completely ignored the heavily armed guards. He pulled forth the thick, highly official stack of parchment documents he had retrieved from the dark, locked room upon the mountain summit. He slammed the heavy paper directly onto the cold stone ledger belonging to the magistrate. The loud slap of the heavy parchment echoed violently across the quiet courtyard. Callahan delivered a deeply resonant, incredibly powerful declaration. His low, rumbling voice vibrated completely through the freezing morning air. He ordered the highly corrupt magistrate to read the official ink. He revealed the highly guarded, absolute secret of the isolated peak. The heavy documents were not merely the deed to the cold timber and the frozen stone. They contained the highly legal, entirely proven rights to a massive, incredibly rich vein of pure gold buried deep within the high mountain rock. The solitary trapper possessed highly staggering, completely immense wealth that utterly dwarfed the fabricated, deeply cruel debts of the late husband. He stared directly into the highly terrified eyes belonging to the magistrate. He declared with absolute, highly unbreakable conviction that the beautiful widow and the innocent child belonged completely to him. He publicly claimed them as his highly protected, legally bound family. He challenged the deeply greedy men to question the immense wealth or attempt to breach his massive physical defense. The corrupt magistrate stared at the highly official gold claim. His pale hands trembled violently. The deeply cruel world of the valley completely crumbled before the absolute, overwhelming power belonging to the stoic protector. The magistrate recognized highly profoundly that the towering giant could legally purchase the entire miserable town and burn it to the freezing mud if he truly desired. The greedy official completely surrendered. He signaled the heavily armed guards to completely abandon the heavy iron shackles. The cruel men backed away in absolute, highly humiliating defeat, retreating into the dark shadows of the stone building. The highly terrible threat of the debtor prison completely vanished, destroyed forever by the pure, absolute devotion belonging to the mountain man. Callahan turned his broad, heavily scarred shoulders. He looked down at the highly fragile, deeply exhausted woman standing upon the cold stone. Evelina wept completely freely. The highly hot tears streamed down her pale, beautiful face. The profound, immense emotional release completely overwhelmed her delicate frame. She instinctively reached for the faded, highly frayed fabric of her dark cotton sleeve, deeply preparing to twist the rough material in her highly nervous, deeply ingrained habit. The massive, highly calloused hands belonging to Callahan reached out. He highly gently, incredibly carefully took her small, pale hands completely into his own. He stopped her trembling fingers from grasping the frayed cotton. He completely unraveled her highly nervous defense. He lowered his highly towering frame, kneeling slightly to look directly into her beautiful, tear-filled hazel eyes. He spoke in a highly soft, incredibly raw whisper that completely contrasted his terrifying exterior. He begged her absolutely never to run away into the freezing dark again. He confessed highly profoundly that his immense, entirely absolute wealth completely lacked any value if she was not sitting safely beside the roaring stone hearth. He gently wiped a stray tear from her flushed cheek with the rough pad of his heavy thumb. He validated her absolute worth, whispering that she had completely saved his lonely, highly isolated soul. He asked her highly deeply to remain upon the high mountain forever, completely accepting his highly scarred heart as her true, eternal home. Evelina looked directly into the deep, highly gentle brown eyes belonging to the giant. The heavy, protective walls of her dark past completely shattered into pure, highly beautiful light. She completely released all her deeply ingrained fears. She stepped forward, throwing her delicate arms completely around the highly thick, muscular neck belonging to the mountain man. She buried her pale face highly deeply into the heavy canvas of his winter coat. She breathed a highly fragile, incredibly joyful promise directly against his broad shoulder. She completely accepted his deeply beautiful, absolute devotion, firmly declaring that she absolutely never wanted to be anywhere else in the entire world. The heavy iron wheels belonging to the wagon eventually carried the reunited family back up the highly winding mountain path. The cruel, deeply miserable valley completely faded into the heavy distance, utterly losing its dark, highly terrifying power forever. The bright, incredibly beautiful spring sunlight completely bathed the isolated summit in glorious, profound warmth. Inside the heavy timber cabin, the deep, highly stagnant silence of the solitary trapper was permanently replaced by the highly musical, incredibly sweet laughter belonging to Clara. The heavy, rusted iron padlock was completely discarded. The deeply hidden secrets were entirely revealed, establishing absolute, completely unbroken trust within the beautiful makeshift family. Evelina sat near the roaring stone hearth, highly gently holding a small wooden sewing hoop. Her highly delicate, pale fingers moved with beautiful, quiet purpose, mending a highly soft cotton shirt. She absolutely no longer twisted the frayed fabric of her dark sleeve. The highly nervous, deeply painful habit had completely vanished, permanently replaced by an absolute, highly profound certainty of her immense worth and complete physical safety. The terrifying beast of the isolated mountain sat highly closely beside her upon the rough floorboards. His massive, heavily scarred frame completely relaxed. He highly carefully utilized a small iron knife to carve a beautiful, incredibly detailed wooden bear for the highly delighted young girl playing near the warm fire. The towering woodsman completely paused his highly gentle work. He looked highly quietly across the deeply warm, absolutely peaceful room. His deep brown eyes met the beautiful, highly bright hazel eyes belonging to the fragile widow. The highly profound, heavily unspoken longing had completely transformed into a highly deep, totally eternal devotion. He offered a highly rare, incredibly brilliant smile. Evelina returned the highly beautiful expression, leaning her highly delicate head completely against his immensely broad, highly secure shoulder. The absolute, neat, highly heavy presence of the silent protector completely enveloped her fragile spirit. They had successfully survived the highly brutal winter storms and the deeply cruel, highly unforgiving world. The fragile, the seven, beautiful widow, and the deeply stoic mountain man had absolutely found their permanent, highly sacred forever home upon the beautiful peak. This story is a work of fiction generated by an artificial intelligence model. The characters, settings, events, and circumstances described within are entirely products of imagination and are not based on real historical figures, living or deceased persons, or actual historical events. The overarching narrative focuses purely on emotional healing, wholesome family values, and constructive personal growth. This content adheres strictly to safe, family-friendly guidelines and contains no graphic violence, explicit material, or harmful themes. Any resemblance to real-life occurrences or actual persons is purely coincidental. The primary goal of this creative work is to provide an uplifting, heart-warming, and emotionally cathartic storytelling experience.